Hey everyone, welcome back to this Saturday's walk and talk. I'm in Lone Butte, which is close to 100 Mile House, so shout out to all those old friends of mine from 100 Mile House. Today I'm going to talk to you about failure and making mistakes and how important that is to our kids' development and developing emotional intelligence. So the reason why failure is so important when it comes to doing tasks or even making mistakes with their behaviors, because it allows kids to develop that strength. In previous videos, we talked about the prefrontal cortex and assigning tasks to your kids' wants and needs so that they learn some work ethic. And it's the same thing is true when it comes to failure and making mistakes, because when you can pick yourself up and dust yourself off, you start developing that inner strength and belief that you can grow. And one thing that us educator folk know all about is having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And so we want our kids to fail, and we don't want to bail them out. We want to work with them so they can become stronger and work through whatever they're struggling with. And again, this is where co-regulation may pop in as well. If they're struggling to the point where they're frustrated and are ready to quit, we might want to just give them that little push, right? And that's super important because it helps develop that perseverance and grit. Not to mention, we want our kids to develop that emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is all about developing resilience through perseverance and understanding yourself. And so being personally aware of where you're at in terms of your mental state is super important for our kids, because if they are self-aware and they know they're struggling, they can self-regulate, self-soothe, and calm themselves. They can calm their amygdala and not get into that fight, flight, and freeze response and decide to quit. And when they do that, they start to develop an inner strength. When our kids persevere and they self-assess and they self-regulate, it allows them to build tolerance. And that's the big thing about failure, is it allows us to rewire. It allows our kids to rewire their brain so it becomes more in tune with growth rather than, I can't do this, I'll never be able to do this, I quit, which is a fixed mindset, and we don't want that. And so that's where a growth mindset and emotional intelligence go hand in hand. Now, the same can be true for kids when it comes to their behavior. I've done a number of videos on kids making mistakes with their behavior and having the right consequence and holding them accountable, which is super important because we want that. But we also want our kids to make mistakes with their behavior because then they learn, right? When our kids make mistakes with their behavior, it allows them to stop and critically think about their actions and decide for themselves a lot of the times if what they did was right or wrong. And we want to establish that, because if our kids are perfect all the time and they're not making mistakes, they're not going to learn as quickly, and I always sometimes caution parents who have kids who are perfect, where they don't make mistakes, they do the right thing, they listen all the time, they don't challenge you, and they don't frustrate you, and they're just little angels, which is all fine and dandy, and it makes parenting a lot easier. But when they get older and they get confronted by things that are wrong and potentially dangerous, and they haven't experienced it yet, and they make a mistake with their behavior, their decisions, it could end up in tragedy, and we don't want that. That's why we want our kids to be able to make mistakes with their behavior. And that's where we step in and we provide consequences and we hold them accountable, but we co-regulate and we teach them right from wrong. And we move forward in that regard because it develops kids' emotional intelligence. Now, here's the other piece to this that we have to be very careful about. The other piece we have to be careful about, which I talked about in my last video, where I discussed, it was like an 80-20 rule where we want to do the gentle parenting piece and we want to love and show affection and have our kids laugh and, but when they're being little turds and you can't get them to do the right thing and they're just not listening, where they're like that, and we come in with the whole, you know what, you need to sit your ass down right now. You need to listen, where we might have to raise our voice or show a little bit of bite. It's super important. Or we might have to, make our kids feel a little bit of shame for a behavior that deserved it, or feel a little bit of guilt for doing the wrong thing. And again, small doses, but you pull them out. And then once you're done with that, you bring them back and you teach them right from wrong, and you help your kids co-regulate and do the right thing. Where we get into trouble as parents, as I mentioned in my last video, is if we do that too much. I'm going through a bit of a treacherous spot right here. Don't worry, I have my bear spray, so we're okay, I think. But what we need to avoid as parents is when our kids do make mistakes, we can't shame them. We can't make them feel guilty. We can't have a kid, when they make a mistake with their behavior, feel that shame or that guilt too often. Because if you do, guess what's going to happen? Your kid is going to start lying to you. And we don't want our kids lying to us because it's easier to avoid a punishment or a consequence or being held accountable. We don't want that, because if our kids get to that place where they avoid consequences and accountability because we're not teaching and we're using those negative emotions too much, we're going to have kids who aren't going to feel safe with making mistakes or failing at things. And when they do that, that's where you run into issues when they're teenagers and they won't lean on you. A perfect example is, I have teenagers, and without hesitation, my kids know that if it's 3:00 in the morning, as much as it might piss me off to have to get out of bed because I like my sleep, I will go get them. No questions asked, no judgment, no guilt tripping, no shaming them. I will get them. It's the same thing, having a daughter who may be out with her friends. I'm always cognizant of the fact that somebody could spike her drink or do something like that. And I make sure she knows, I don't care where she is, when it is, where I'm at, that if something goes sideways, if she makes a mistake with her decisions, that I will be there and she doesn't have to fear being guilted or ridiculed for making that mistake. So it's super important that we encourage failure, we encourage mistakes, because it helps to rewire that brain. It develops that emotional intelligence. It develops that growth mindset. But we have to make sure that we do it in a way that is safe so that our kids feel like they can make mistakes, they can fail, and they won't have to suffer any negative consequences that revolve around things like shame and guilt. Even though we're still going to hold our kids accountable, and even though they're still going to have consequences, one of the things that you have to do is you still have to have conversations about doing the right thing and the wrong thing. More specifically, the right thing when they're not in trouble. I found that with my kids, once they started turning into teenagers, some of the best educational conversations I had about real life and growing up happened in the vehicle on the way to basketball games or volleyball games. And quite frankly, I often had their friends in the vehicle, whether it be Cruz or Evie, and we always talked about doing the right and the wrong thing. But that didn't mean at some point when they weren't in shit for something, we didn't have a conversation about the mistake that they made the last time they were out. And so this time, hey, when you go out, remember what happened. Let's not do that again. But if it does, do not get into a vehicle with somebody who's drinking and driving. Avoid getting into that conflict with somebody. But if you have to escape, you call and I'll be right there. And guess what? That's what you want. That's what you want. You want your kids to feel safe with coming to you with their mistake and their failures. There should be no eye rolls. There should be no facial expressions, no guilt, no shame. And they need to know that they can trust you. And being somebody who's worked in 3 high schools, I know for a fact how often kids hide stuff from their parents because they're worried about what the repercussions will be, or they're worried that their mom is going to make them feel guilty, or their dad's going to make them feel shame, or they're going to get screamed and yelled at, even though that's not what they need. And hence the reason why a lot of these teenagers have strong relationships with teachers in their school, because they know that the teachers or counselors aren't going to judge them or ridicule them for making mistakes. And we see it far too often. So that's the key. Now, again, it all ties in. You can go back to my first video on developing the prefrontal cortex, the second video on the fight, flight, and freeze response. You can go to the videos about accountability and consequences. And so this video specifically is about failure and making mistakes and how important it is to developing emotional intelligence, which is super crucial to our kids developing those critical thinking, creative thinking, personal awareness and social awareness and communication skills, right? It's all very important, and you can't get there if your kids don't make mistakes. So I'm not saying that you should beat yourself up if your kids aren't making mistakes with their behavior or if they're not failing at things, because don't worry, they'll give you the opportunity. You just need to be more mindful once they get to college and stuff that they will, and you need to be ready for it. And for those of us who had kids, who punched holes in the wall, who refused to go to school, and, all those kinds of behaviors, stay the course, have those conversations. Don't make them feel shame or guilt unless it's momentary or something that they really need to sit in that shame or that guilt for that moment. And then you co-regulate, bring them back out, make sure everything's okay, and you use it as a teachable moment to teach what's right and go from there. And on that note, I hope you got something out of this little walk and talk today, and stay tuned for next Saturday's walk and talk, and we'll talk to you later. Peace out from 100 Mile House.